The glass didn't shatter. That was the worst part. Damian set it down with such deliberate force, such practiced menace, that the marble absorbed the impact without complaint. A small violence, a controlled one. The kind he had perfected over years of learning that power need not be loud to be felt. You didn't build this life. His voice was low, almost gentle. You married into it. Isabella Vale did not flinch. She had learned, somewhere between the 3rd year of marriage and the 5th, that flinching only fed him. So she stood in the amber glow of the chandelier, that obscene, glittering thing he'd had imported from Venice, and let his words pass through her like weather. Something shifted inside her chest. Not a breaking. An awakening. The Cross Estate occupied the highest ground in the city, the way empires always do, by force of will and borrowed money. White stone, iron gates, floodlights that made the facade glow gold against the night sky, because Damian Cross had never once done anything quietly. She had loved that about him, once. The argument had begun over dinner, or rather, over the absence of a necklace. Diamonds he'd selected because he preferred to dress her like a display case rather than a woman. She had worn a simple gown instead, navy, modest, something that was hers. You represent my name, he'd told her at the foot of the staircase, his jaw tight. She had turned to face him then. I married you, Damian, not your diamonds. He hadn't laughed. Men like him never did when the joke was on them. Now they stood in the living room while the rain found the windows, and she studied his face, the handsome, hardened face of a man who had confused acquisition with achievement for so long that he could no longer see the difference. Every wall, he said, gesturing broadly at the cathedral ceilings, the art, the marble veined like a body with secrets. Every car, every view. I built this. She said nothing. He mistook her silence for surrender. He always had. You had nothing before me. And there it was, the sentence she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. The line drawn so cleanly in the air between them that she felt the severing like a physical thing. She walked toward the staircase. Where are you going? To pack. He laughed, the laugh of a man who cannot conceive of consequences. Good. Maybe the cold will remind you who gave you all of this. She paused at the bottom step, just long enough to look back. His watch caught the light, the same wrist she had held on a beach in Portugal, years before all this stone and silence, back when his hands were warm and his ambitions were still shared, when he used to whisper, "We'll build something together like a prayer rather than a threat." Together. Strange, how a word could hollow out. She had been 26 when they met. He was 31, ambitious and sharp enough to look twice. It was a property conference, the kind packed with men who spoke too loudly and listened too little. Isabella had been presenting data on undervalued land corridors in the northwest quarter when she noticed someone actually paying attention. Not the predatory attention she was accustomed to navigating, something more genuine. You talk about numbers like they're alive, he said afterward. They are, she replied, if you know how to listen. He had been drawn to her mind first. Then her laughter, which arrived unexpectedly and often. Then the way she challenged him, not to diminish, but to sharpen. Their early years unfolded in small apartments and late-night take-out containers and plans sketched across whatever surface was available. She had money, already, more than he knew, quietly accumulated, carefully held. But she didn't lead with it. She led with ideas, with presence. He would pull her close in their narrow kitchen and say, "One day I'll give you a palace," and she would kiss the corner of his mouth and whisper back, "Just don't lose yourself building it." He hadn't heard her. Not really. The bedroom was vast and cold and immaculate in the way of rooms no one truly inhabits. She did not mourn it. She opened her closet, the rows of unworn gowns, the shoes chosen by someone who saw her as an extension of his aesthetic, and she chose instead a single suitcase, her grandmother's ring, her documents, and the locked leather folder from the back of the drawer, the one she had not opened in 3 years but had never once forgotten. She tucked it under her arm. Downstairs, she could hear the pour of another drink, the specific sound of a man performing his own confidence. "You'll come back." His voice floated up through the house. "You always do." She walked to the front door. The butler, Thomas, who had worked in this house since before either of them, looked at her with his careful, practiced neutrality. Only his eyes betrayed him. "Ma'am?" "I'll be away for a while," she said quietly. The door opened. Rain, cold and clean and indifferent. It found her face immediately, and she let it. Behind her, Damian's voice rose in pitch, the careful control fracturing slightly at last. "If you walk out that door, Isabella, don't expect to walk back in." She turned one final time. He stood in the entrance hall, the golden light framing him perfectly, the way he had always required to be framed. He looked powerful, eternal, certain. She gave him a smile of absolute composure. "You're right," she said. "I won't." The door closed between them like a sentence ending. The city at midnight. The driver moved toward her with an umbrella. She stopped him with a gesture. She stood in the rain fully for a moment. Just a moment. Then stepped into the car. Her phone lit up in her bag. Unknown number. Board meeting confirmed for Monday. Awaiting your final instruction, Ms. Vale. She typed 3 words without hesitation. Proceed with review. The city opened ahead of her as the car descended from the hill. All glass and light and noise, the skyline she had watched being built, in some cases had caused to be built, stretching to the horizon. Damian Cross stood alone in the mansion on the hill. He poured the drink he hadn't needed and told himself the things men tell themselves, that she would cool down, that she had nowhere to go, that everything in this city bore his name. He believed it. He had never once checked whether he was right. Aurelius. The hotel suite was quiet and ordered, the way Isabella herself was quiet and ordered, not from absence, but from control. A man in a charcoal suit stood as she entered. On the table between them, files, financial models, risk assessments, all bearing the logo of Cross Developments in the upper corner. Ms. Vale. He dipped his head slightly. As majority shareholder of Aurelius Capital, your instruction will determine the future of Cross Development's funding agreement. She moved to the window. Below her, the city glittered like scattered currency. Her city, her investments were woven into that skyline, the way roots are woven into earth, invisible from above, but foundational to everything standing on the surface. She had never needed the credit. She had only wanted to be seen. Has performance declined? She asked. Significantly. Risk exposure is considerable. Then we act as investors. Her voice was flat and precise, not as spouses. A pause. Should we notify Mr. Cross? She turned from the window. No. The word landed quietly, the way the heaviest things always do. Let the numbers speak. Before the marriage, what he never knew. She had built Aurelius Capital in the years before she met him, quietly, methodically, buying undervalued land when no one was looking, selling when the moment was right, reinvesting before the ink was dry. She did not seek headlines. She preferred architecture to applause, building structures that would outlast the people who doubted her. When she met Damian, she recognized his talent genuinely. He had fire, direction, an instinct for opportunity that was real, if raw. What he lacked was patience, and capital, and the right connections. She provided all three without announcement. She introduced him to lenders whose numbers she quietly controlled. She reviewed his project drafts in the dark while he slept beside her, catching the errors he would have been humiliated by in the morning. When his first tower nearly collapsed over a permit dispute, the kind of crisis that ends careers, she made a single phone call. The problem dissolved by dawn. He credited the universe. He never thought to credit his wife. She never corrected him. Some forms of invisibility are chosen. The unraveling. The email arrived in Damian's inbox at 6:47 on a Thursday morning. Subject: Temporary review of funding agreement, Aurelius Capital. He read it twice, then a third time, as though repetition might change the meaning. Funding suspended pending reassessment of financial performance and risk exposure. He laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, and reached for his phone. His CFO didn't answer. His legal team offered careful language that said nothing. By Friday, the calls were coming from the other direction. Banks, suppliers, contractors, partners who had heard the word review and understood exactly what it meant. He stood in his grand living room and looked at the chandelier he'd had imported from Venice and felt, for the first time, that the house was not his. That it had never quite been his. That he was living inside a structure someone else had designed. The emergency board meeting convened on a Monday. Damian stood at the head of the table with his practiced smile and his expensive suit and the particular posture of a man trying very hard to project certainty he no longer felt. "This review is procedural," he began. "We will—" The doors opened. Every head turned. Isabella Vale walked into the room in a white suit and absolute composure. No jewelry. No performance. Just presence. The kind that doesn't require announcement because it has never once required anyone's permission. Damian went still. "What are you doing here?" he asked, quietly. The way people ask questions they already fear the answer to. She did not look at him immediately. She took the seat at the far end of the table, his end, by implication, her end, by right, and folded her hands. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Cross," a pause waited with something. "Allow me to formally introduce the majority shareholder of Aurelius Capital, Miss Isabella Vale." The silence in the room was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Damian's face did something complicated. The practiced confidence cracked, then reassembled, then cracked again. He looked at her the way people look at magicians, with the desperate hope that the mechanism will be revealed and the world will make sense again. "That's not possible," he said. She met his eyes for the first time. "It always was." "This is—" He stopped. Started again. "You financed me?" "No." Her voice was steady, soft even. "I partnered with you." She let the distinction settle over the table. "You stopped seeing me as an equal." He swallowed. "You could have told me." She tilted her head slightly. "You stopped listening." Closure. The restructuring moved quickly, as these things do when the paperwork was drawn up years in advance by a woman who understood that preparation is its own form of strength. Projects were reorganized. Oversight transferred. The estate, financed through layered structures that bore her signature in the fine print he had never read, passed under Aurelius' review. She did not ruin him. She had never wanted to ruin him. She simply stopped holding him up. Weeks later, he stood outside the gates of the house on the hill. The security acknowledged him with a politeness that contained no deference. He had aged in the interval, not dramatically. He was still handsome, still put together, but something behind his eyes had been revised. She met him at the door. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The city spread below them in the late afternoon light. "I never knew," he said finally. "You never asked." He looked at the house, at the gardens, at the life they had assembled together, and which he had somehow managed to call entirely his own. "I loved you," he said. Her chest tightened. Because this was true. She knew it was true, had always known it, and truth, in this context, was not exoneration. "I loved you too," she said. Another silence, fuller than the last. "I don't want any of it," he said quietly. "The house. The restructuring. I want to understand how I lost you." She looked at him for a long time. Then she placed her hand lightly against his chest, over his heart, that complicated engine, and held it there for a moment. "You didn't lose me the night you told me to leave." Her voice was careful, precise, the way she always was with things that mattered. "You lost me long before that. The moment you decided your vision of this life was the only one worth counting." A tear moved down his face. He didn't wipe it away. She stepped back. "I'm not taking revenge," she said. "I'm taking back my name." He nodded slowly. Walked back to the gates. She watched him go. Inside, the mansion settled around her. All that marble, all that silence, all that height. She stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the chandelier burning above her. She had not cried. She was not sure she would. What she felt was not triumph. It was something quieter and more permanent. The feeling of a woman who had spent years being invisible in plain sight, who had poured her capital and her intellect and her patience into a life she was then told she had merely married into, and who had finally simply stopped pretending that was acceptable. "You said you built this empire alone." She turned off the light. "But you never looked down to see whose hands were holding the ground beneath you." The chandelier went dark. Outside, the city hummed on. And somewhere in the skyline, in the buildings and the foundations and the quietly held majority stakes, Isabella Vale's name was written in the language she had always preferred. Not in gold. In numbers.